The stench hit him first, a thick, cloying miasma of unwashed bodies, stale urine, damp earth, and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old blood. It clung to the very air, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on the soul. Welcome to the medieval prison, a labyrinth of despair where the lines between justice and torment blurred, and the price of freedom was often paid in flesh and sanity. For centuries, across the sprawling, often brutal landscapes of medieval Europe, men, women, and even children found themselves ensnared within these stone maw, whether by the swift, unforgiving hand of justice or the cruel caprice of power. Their fates converged in places that defied human decency. These were not the sterile, regulated institutions of a later age, but rather unregulated, frequently packed, verminous, ill-ventilated, and badly sewered pits of human misery. To step within their walls was to descend into a realm where the very air was a torment, and hope a fleeting phantom dot, as with most things in this age. The clink of coin echoed louder than the cries of the condemned. Money, the eternal arbiter, spoke volumes even within these confines. To enter a medieval prison with a purse full of silver, or at least with powerful, wealthy friends on the outside, was to possess a lifeline, a fragile shield against the worst of its horrors. For the privileged, imprisonment could be a mere inconvenience, a temporary cessation of liberty rather than a descent into hell. Consider the curious case of Amar de Montfort, the papal chaplain, a man of God entangled in the earthly machinations of power. In 1276, his own cousin, King Edward I of England, saw fit to confine him within the formidable walls of Cough Castle. But this was no common man's plight. Amar de Montfort resided there not in a squalid cell, but with his retinue, 8 grooms, and for valets. One could hardly imagine him having to hard a time of it. The very architecture of the prison tower at Cough, built by Edward I himself during his conquest of Wales in the 1280s, laid bare the stark chasm between the classes. Suspected felons, the nameless, faceless mass, were relegated to the lower chambers, accessible only through a treacherous trapdoor, their only communion with the outside world a tiny, high-set window. Yet, for men like Amar, the deputies' chambers beckoned, boasting much larger windows, offering glimpses of the sky, a stark reminder of the world they might one day reclaim. One could only pray to be sent to a prison deemed easier, a relative term in this grim lexicon. Ludgate in London, which opened its gates around 1378, was occasionally closed not for reform, but because it was thought to offer relatively comfortable confinement. From Ludgate, however, the unfortunate convicts were often transferred to Newgate, a name that echoed with dread, where death was a frequent visitor. Another jail, surprisingly considered too comfy, was the Fleet. John Paston, a man who knew its confines intimately, having served time there on 3 separate occasions, described it simply as a fair prison. Like the Tower of London, the Fleet was a king's prison, primarily housing those who owed money to the crown. This meant its inmates were often drawn from the higher echelons of society. A desperate man, accused of a graver offense, might even lie, claiming a debt to the exchequer, hoping to secure a place within its less brutal walls. But even this relative sanctuary came at a price. The keeper demanded 2 shillings and 6pence. At the door, a sum 2 shillings higher than any other London prison. The message was clear. Even comfort had its cost. It was an unspoken truth, accepted without question by medieval society. The poor and petty criminal would endure far worse than the rich murderer. Fairness was a concept alien to this system. Beyond the initial entry fee, the struggle continued. Basic provisions, food, bedding, coal, lamps were not provided but had to be purchased from the keeper, often at outrageously inflated prices. For those without means, this was a slow, agonizing starvation. Yet, a flicker of humanity, however dim, existed. The medieval world, surprisingly, held charity in high regard. Destitute prisoners often relied on alms, charitable bequests, and even confiscated foodstuffs. And for the utterly penniless, there was always the grim camaraderie of sharing a bed, a desperate measure that at least made survival marginally cheaper. Even in the fair Fleet, the illusion of comfort could shatter. In 1354, the callous disregard of butchers who threw animal guts into a nearby wharf, transformed the prison into a cesspool, poisoning the air and endangering every soul within. 2 years later, tanneries sprang up nearby, their latrines built directly on the banks of a surrounding ditch, further polluting the environment. The very air became a vector of disease. Even the Tower of London, bastion of the king's power, offered no guarantee of salubrious detention. In 1295, Matthew of the Exchequer, a man of some standing, lodged a chilling complaint. He had been subjected to a number of enormities, confined in the Black Cellar on the bare ground, where he languished for 2 years without any kind of fire or light. His only sustenance, apart from meager food, was water from the well of the tower where the rats drowned themselves. It seemed even the vermin, in their desperate scramble for survival, recognized the appalling conditions, that outside influences were a constant, insidious threat. Nationwide epidemics, like the devastating one in 1316, swept through English prisons, causing a sharp, terrifying upturn in deaths. Impure drinking water was a perpetual problem, a slow poison, and then there was jail fever, now identified as typhus, a contagious scourge that thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions, mowing down inmates with ruthless efficiency. Escape, a desperate gamble, was the ultimate dream. Sometimes, by a stroke of luck or sheer audacity, it succeeded. For prisoners, driven by an unyielding will to be free, once scaled the roof of Newgate Prison in London, taking a female hostage as their grim insurance. Richard, son of Nigel, achieved an almost comical escape from Oxford Prison in 1225. He simply walked out. The lax supervision at Oxford was a glaring problem, and Richard, with a defiant logic, justified his flight by declaring that prison was bad for him. His brief taste of freedom, however, was short-lived. He was soon recaptured and thrown into solitary confinement at Northampton Jail, a place designed to break the spirit. There, he claimed, he was mentally affected, plagued by visions, believing the devil had appeared to him dressed as a monk. In his delirium, he had no alternative but to pull stones out of the walls and throw them at the demon to defend himself. For this desperate, futile act became his signature. He had attempted to break out of 3 different prisons, using this method, digging out a basin full, a barrow full, and then a cartload full of stones. Despite these frantic, almost insane attempts, Richard was ultimately dragged to the place of execution and hanged, his struggle for freedom ending on the gallows. Manacles, those cold, unforgiving embraces of iron, were the primary tools to thwart such desperate bids for liberty. Yet even these could fail. When Richard was put in irons at Northampton, he somehow managed to break the clip from the chain that fastened him to the block. John Blakeman, taken to a tower in Canterbury in 1220, had been confined to the deepest, most secure part of the prison, yet he too managed to break out despite wearing 3 pairs of irons. The term irons itself was a chillingly broad categorization, encompassing all manner of implements designed to shackle the body, chains around the neck, wrists, or ankles. John Purr, writing to a family member in Norfolk, lamented that he was fettered worse than ever and was manacled in the hands by day and night. In 1391, Northampton Jail boasted 2 iron columns, specifically for tying up prisoners, alongside begging balls, a cruel irony. At Hereford in 1509, the inventory included 3 great iron shoes and 3 pairs of thumb screws, implements that looked suspiciously like instruments of torture. It was a stark, brutal truth. Some wardens, given the unchecked power of their positions, were not adverse to brutalizing prisoners when they felt inclined. The line between punishment and torture was often erased. By the end of the 13th century, breaking out of the king's jail was only punishable by death. If the original crime was a capital offense, for many, the risk was worth the potential reward of freedom. Sometimes, a little help from friends could turn the tide. In 1281, during the tumultuous Peasants' Revolt, the rebels, fueled by a righteous fury, successfully freed a serf imprisoned in Rochester Jail. In London, at Marshalsea, the keeper of the prison was dragged outside by the enraged protesters and summarily executed. a brutal testament to the public's simmering resentment. In 1450, during Jack Cade's revolt, Newgate suffered extensive damage, and its keeper not only faced a hefty fine, but also received a taste of his own medicine. He too was imprisoned. If an inmate escaped due to the keeper's negligence, the keeper was held liable, a rare but welcome consequence for the prisoners. For the most part, however, keepers were a cruel and greedy lot. Their pay was meager, their job thankless. Their only means of making a decent living was by extorting the very prisoners in their care, squeezing every last coin for basic necessities, and the dangers extended beyond the keepers. A grim reality for inmates was that their fellow captives might also be held responsible for an escape, even if they were entirely unaware of the plot. If an escapee was caught, the punishment was swift and unforgiving. They would typically be moved to another, often harsher, jail, forced to start their prison term again. Time already served meant nothing once one had absconded. Beyond the city walls, in the sprawling countryside, purpose-built prisons were a rarity. A castle, with its formidable defenses, seemed the obvious choice to house a suspect, and many indeed possessed dungeons for this very purpose. Yet, prisoners were not always confined within the relative shelter of the main building. Many were kept in cages and crude huts scattered around the castle yard, exposed to the relentless elements. A cruel form of punishment in itself. Stocks, those infamous wooden contraptions, served as open-air prisons, holding many until they could be transferred for trial. In Chester, in 1301, 4 pairs of great wooden stocks were built for the secure custody of those accused. But security came at a terrible price. In Salisbury in 1384, a chilling report emerged. Some prisoners had died because they were kept in the stocks during a bitterly cold winter. A rotting of the feet was a common affliction for those confined to the stocks, and indeed, within the prisons themselves, due to the constant use of fetters on the ankles. One 13th century account describes a man and a woman suffering from an aggregate of 1 foot, a horrifying testament to the gangrene and decay that set in. For the wayward churchman, a different path existed. Any cleric accused of a crime could plead clergy, opting to be tried by an ecclesiastical court rather than a secular one. The church courts were notoriously more lenient, favoring penance in prison over the brutal secular punishments of execution or mutilation. Even for serious offenses, a man might, therefore, consider having his head tonsured and memorizing a piece of the Latin Bible. Hoping to exploit this legal loophole, York Minster Cathedral, for instance, maintained its own prison specifically for naughty members of the church. York also held the distinction of possessing the only known forest prison, used for anyone caught breaking the strict laws of the forest. In 1135, a man known as David, the king's larderer, not only ensured the king had enough meat when visiting York, but also served as the keeper of this unique forest prison. The air in these medieval prisons was a palpable entity, smoggy, stinky, and swarming with lice. When outside pandemics or famines swept across a region, their devastating effects inevitably seeped into the prisons. It was not as if inmates received large amounts of fresh fruit and vegetables to bolster their immune systems. Sanitation was practically non-existent. Even jails fortunate enough to possess purpose-built privies suffered from abysmal conditions. And ventilation was pretty poor, perhaps deliberately so, to keep any disease in rather than to keep the fresh air out. Some rooms had fires, but chimneys were a luxury, not common even in wealthy homes until the 15th century. The air, consequently, would have been thick and unpleasant with smoke. Though the meager warmth it offered was a small, desperate bonus, the authorities, in their own crude way, were desperate to prevent disease from spreading to the outside world. For the medieval mind, a lawbreaker was often seen as diseased, someone who needed to be kept away from decent members of society. Overcrowding was a chronic problem, and too many people inevitably meant too little food. In 1306, jail was described as so full of prisoners that many of them had died and die from day to day. Inside Newgate in 1341, the situation was equally dire. It was so full of prisoners that they were continually dying of hunger and oppression, Starvation and disease were constant companions. Parasites thrived amidst the frequently packed assemblage of unwashed bodies within the ill-ventilated and badly sewered rooms at your prison. It was said, the very walls are said to be covered with lice. At another jail, the horror was even more vivid. Lice crackling under their feet made such a noise as walking on the shells which were strewed over garden walks. To be innocent and hope for a quick trial and release was often a hopeless delusion. Many suspects languished for years before receiving any semblance of justice. In the 13th century, an alleged horse thief waited to agonizing years for his trial at Guildford Jail before finally being acquitted. A woman accused of murdering her husband was left to rot for 20 years, her life consumed by the slow, grinding machinery of injustice. These are but a few glimpses into the harrowing reality of medieval prisons. They were not places of rehabilitation, but rather holding pens of despair, where the value of a human life was often measured by the weight of their purse. The very air was a testament to suffering, and the days stretched into an eternity of hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. Why, indeed, would anyone want to last even 24 hours in such a place? The answer, etched in the stone and the suffering, was simple. They had no choice.